Greetings, everyone. Who is winning between Ukraine and Russia? Putin was extremely humiliated by Zelensky. Ladies and gentlemen, May 9, 2026 will go down in the history of the Russia-Ukraine war as one of the most bizarre and tragic moments of geopolitical shift. In the heart of the sacred Red Square, the sound of marching music still echoed, but the proud tanks and ballistic missiles had completely disappeared. Instead, there was a suffocating atmosphere, unprecedentedly tight security, and the Kremlin that was facing harsh realities both internally and on the front lines. Deep within the fabric of Russian politics, behind the solemn facade of a great power, there is always a harsh, unwritten set of rules. The regime's prestige is measured by its ability to suppress, and any public media humiliation is absolutely intolerable. But that unthinkable thing happened, igniting an unprecedented wave of anger from within Russia itself. The military media channels of Russian military bloggers, who are usually filled with fiery passion, simultaneously erupted in response to this bitter reality. The Young Infantryman channel, Chua Chat, wrote that the government's shame does not lie in the provocative decree of the opponent, but in the fact that the strategists allowed the country's defense capability to be hollowed out, forcing them to beg for a compromise since 2014. They are outraged that a frontline army is constantly held back for negotiations, only to receive contempt in return. The Dao Shan channel frankly admitted that stepping onto the stage with a media-savvy opponent from the very beginning was a fatal mistake, because on the political front like this, the Russians have absolutely no chance of winning. Even the Two Majors channel could only express their outrage at the opponent's malicious move, a person who is too well-versed in manipulating the global information war. Turning back the clock to about a week ago, this psychological shock stemmed from one of the most sacred symbolic events, the Victory Day Parade on May 9th at Red Square, commemorating the triumph of the Soviet Red Army over Nazi Germany in World War II. However, in the context where Ukrainian drones have proven their ability to penetrate air defense systems and strike deep into the heart of the Russian capital, Red Square has never seemed so vulnerable. Concerns swept over the Kremlin as they had to make an unprecedented decision to cancel the display of heavy military equipment, tanks, and ballistic missiles that had always been the pride of previous parades. This year, the lack of weapons and absence of international leaders made the podium feel cold and empty. Let's remember that just a year ago, in 2025, President Vladimir Putin proudly stood next to Chinese President Xi Jinping and Brazilian President Lula da Silva. Now, harsh reality forces Moscow to seek a way out through a truce. They once tried to unilaterally declare a ceasefire, but that plan completely failed when the other side managed to get ahead and announce a ceasefire first. As a result, when Russia couldn't restrain itself and bombed a kindergarten, it destroyed its own negotiating credibility, giving Ukraine the perfect reason to ignore any proposals from Moscow. As strategic options gradually ran out and the moment of truth approached, President Vladimir Putin had to seek the intervention of U.S. President Donald Trump to establish a temporary ceasefire agreement in order to save his important holiday. At that very moment, Ukrainian President Zelensky, a true master in the art of provocation and psychological manipulation, saw a golden opportunity to seize the initiative with a statement that shocked the international media. He boldly issued a decree allowing the Russian Federation to hold a military parade in the city of Moscow on May 9, 2026. Russia's ceremony still took place in peace, but it was a bitter peace, because everyone understood that the Kremlin had to rely on Washington to ask the leader of Kiev for a day of peace. To the world, this diplomatic move seemed like an arrogant trick by a foreign leader. But more deeply, this was a critical blow directly to the prestige of a great power. That hypothetical decree revealed a stark truth to the whole world. The situation on the Ukrainian battlefield is quietly shifting. Volodymyr Zelensky's sarcastic remark may be a cold splash of water, salt rubbed into Moscow's wound, but in reality that wound had already been torn open before, and now it is only getting worse. Internal public opinion is always a silent front, but it possesses an incredibly destructive power. The wave of anger from extremist nationalist forces in Russia, who have always unconditionally supported the Kremlin's campaign, is reaching a peak of tension in light of recent developments. On military media channels, observers are boiling with anger at what they consider an unbearable humiliation. The Special Reconnaissance Guerrilla Company bitterly questions whether this is a campaign for fascistization, militarization, or if Russia itself is stripping away its own status. The Novorossiya militia is stunned to realize that the authorities have given the opponent a golden opportunity to mock and undermine the nation's reputation after years of indulgence. Analyst Lev Vosinin frankly admits that modern history has rarely witnessed such a public and humiliating slap at such a high level. Even experienced military channels have reluctantly admitted that the people involved made themselves targets of global ridicule. The hardline faction demands a massive, destructive, retaliatory strike to regain their honor. However, the Kremlin chose to remain silent, without taking any significant military retaliatory action to save face. Instead, Moscow quietly carried out a large-scale prisoner exchange, with 1,000 people swapped for 1,000 people, a provision that had already been agreed upon as part of the ceasefire agreement. Right on the podium at Red Square, people witnessed an unusual image of President Vladimir Putin. His face clearly showed fatigue, his appearance was haggard, and he was surrounded by an unprecedentedly dense security system. As soon as the marching music ended, the powerful leader quickly left the podium as if wanting to escape the suffocating atmosphere. This astonishing change was also evident in his words to the media right after the ceremony. Instead of the harsh statements or heavy condemnations as before, he referred to the other leader as Mr. Zelensky and implied that the conflict was gradually coming to an end. For Russia and international observers, such a scenario on Victory Day in 2026 would have been completely unimaginable if we look back at the context just a year ago. From the decision to withdraw all heavy equipment from the parade to the confusion in seeking a ceasefire, the harsh reality has exposed a truth that the Kremlin has always tried to avoid. Russia is still deeply bogged down in the quagmire of war, but has lost the strategic tools needed to force the other side to submit to its will. In earlier stages of the war, when the Ukrainian army was exhausted on the front lines and desperately needed aid, such a direct provocation was something no one dared to imagine. And no one could believe that Russia would accept such harsh words without launching a corresponding counterattack. In the past, President Vladimir Putin was famous for his extraordinary resilience in the face of any crisis, capable of destroying the career of any political opponent. But this time, in the face of direct attacks on national pride, his silence unintentionally revealed a bitter truth, much like the story of the emperor's new clothes, exposing the real fragility behind the glamorous facade of a great power. The reality is, even before Victory Day took place, serious internal cracks had already appeared within Russia. Public voices of dissent from some figures close to the Kremlin began to emerge, while hundreds of ordinary people also expressed their dissatisfaction on social media, despite the government's ongoing digital disconnection measures. Increasingly frequent intelligence reports show the extreme caution of the Russian leader, as he has to work in fortified bunkers due to fears of palace coups or assassination plots. The events on May 9 not only failed to restore public or elite confidence, but also clearly reflected the direct deadlock on the battlefield. The war with Ukraine has exceeded all the Kremlin's original expectations. Since early this year, Kyiv has accelerated and surpassed Russia in several areas. Near the front lines, the Ukrainian army has steadfastly held their positions. They have compensated for minor territorial losses by launching offensives and taking control of other strategic areas, especially in the south, while Russian forces are slowly fighting for every meter of land in the eastern Donbass region. Even in the north, around the Sumy region, Russian operations have only managed to capture desolate stretches of land that Ukraine had deliberately abandoned months earlier. That seems to be nothing more than a desperate attempt by statisticians at the Kremlin to create fake victory figures for media display. But even in places where the Russian army is trying to exhaust their forces to advance, they are facing a completely new crisis. The fierce front always demands a price in blood, and for the Russian army, that price is becoming a humanitarian tragedy of terrible proportions. Based on in-depth analysis of inheritance records published by independent Russian media outlets, Medusa and Mediazona, by the end of 2025, as many as 30,052 Russian soldiers have been killed on the battlefield. This horrifying number does not even include paramilitary forces, foreign fighters such as North Korean soldiers, or African immigrants forced to enlist, and it also does not account for those who are wounded, missing, or taken prisoner. Entering 2026, the situation has become even worse as estimates show that each month, Moscow loses about 35,000 troops, surpassing the recruitment rate since the beginning of the year. Fighting inside this belt, Ukrainian soldiers are always fully supplied with necessities, safe shelters, and a steady supply of ammunition, especially drones to wear down the enemy's strength. Not stopping there, Ukraine has also widely deployed unmanned ground vehicles capable of fighting on a large scale. This technology helps protect Ukrainian soldiers' lives, yet Russian leaders show no interest in adopting it or learning from it. For a force that mainly plays a defensive role like Ukraine, having the enemy advance has never been a pleasant thing. But geopolitical reality shows that every meter of land Russia captures comes at an unprecedentedly high cost. When Ukraine deliberately gives up certain positions, they are actually directing Russian troops into well-prepared traps and battlefields. The Russian army has no choice but to rush into these traps because their superiors have long valued the symbolic occupation of land over wise tactical calculations. Ukraine is able to lure the enemy into deadly zones so effectively thanks to their remarkable achievements at the operational level. Here, Kyiv is creating its own advantage with advanced drone technology integrated with artificial intelligence. These smart weapons are capable of autonomously locating targets at medium range and carrying out precise strikes without any human intervention or control. This means they don't need to transmit signals back to the command center, rendering Russia's vaunted electronic warfare and jamming systems harmless. According to recent assessments by international military experts, Ukraine's firing range has now reached deep into territories controlled by Russia, directly striking the vital road and rail infrastructure that supplies the Taimyr Peninsula by land. Now, Ukraine's unmanned vehicles can freely strike throughout the area near the coast of the Azov Sea, severely weakening Russia's defensive capabilities at the Taimyr Isthmus. The harshness of this reality was admitted by a Russian drone developer on social media, revealing that in Donetsk, Russian supply convoys have to limit their size to the minimum, allowing only 2 trucks to travel together to avoid detection. With precise medium-range strikes, Ukraine has completely crushed Russia's preparations for its spring and summer offensive campaigns right from the start. Not by meeting force with force, but by destroying the key logistical supports that determine the success or failure of the campaign. This has forced Russian troops on the front lines into a passive, reactive position, making them easy to fall into traps. The situation has become even more tragic for the Kremlin as, at long range, Ukraine's bombing campaign targeting Russia's energy infrastructure and defense industrial complexes continues without any sign of slowing down. From the Black Sea to the Baltic Sea and deep within Russian territory, oil refineries and strategic export ports have been continuously under fire, with many of them suffering direct strikes repeatedly within just a few weeks. Russia's weapons manufacturing centers, ammunition factories, and assembly lines for military equipment are also facing a similar life-threatening danger. This crisis reached its peak right before the Victory Day celebrations, when Moscow decided to withdraw air defense systems from remote regions to strengthen protection for the 2 main centers, the capital Moscow and the city of St. Petersburg. Although these air defense systems in their previous positions did not directly protect many major targets, they played a vital role in monitoring and early detection of Ukrainian unmanned aerial vehicles as they flew over to target other strategic objectives. The lack of long-range early warning stations resulted in the loss of early warning capability and the inability to reduce the number of enemy drones, making the air defense systems at the final targets easily overloaded and paralyzed. At all 3 levels, close range, medium range, and long range, Russia's decisions seem to only worsen its own strategic deadlock. The Kremlin seems to be falling into a position of isolation as international developments no longer follow its calculations. In the Middle East, the flames of conflict surrounding Iran are on the verge of erupting violently, with no way out in sight. In an ideal scenario, an energy crisis that drives oil prices up would be a huge lifeline for Russia's war economy. However, that opportunity has completely vanished on a macro scale due to Ukraine's long-range bombardments, directly targeting Russia's vital export ports. They even set an ironically ambitious goal to make Russia's energy export activities carbon neutral by 2027, and in reality, they are gradually making that warning come true. While Iran is caught up in its own spiral of tensions, the axis of power shifts toward Beijing as Chinese leaders prepare to welcome U.S. President Donald Trump. The outcome of this summit dialogue remains a big unknown, but it is certainly putting the Kremlin in a state of anxiety as they cannot anticipate the impacts on their own interests. Russia's strategic loneliness becomes even more apparent when looking at the reactions of Western countries to the risks from Ukraine's campaign. Kyiv's long-range attacks toward the Baltic Sea are not without flaws, as debris and unmanned aerial vehicles frequently fall into member countries, especially those located along the northern flight path. Just in recent days, the Latvian Minister of Defense had to resign after 2 Ukrainian drones deviated from their course across the Russian border, destroying oil tanks along their route. Even an unmanned underwater device filled with explosives from Ukraine drifted into Greek waters and was discovered by a fisherman in a coastal cave. However, instead of causing diplomatic crises, these countries have shown Kyiv a strange tolerance. They quietly neutralize the dangers, show patient understanding toward the Ukrainian vehicle operators, and continue to deeply agree with the view that the Kremlin is the one that must bear full responsibility for starting this war. That solid support is concretely demonstrated by the massive €90 billion aid package from the European Union to Ukraine. This is a heavy blow to the morale of the Russian military leadership, as they have to bitterly admit that this financial support will further fuel the opponent's war economy, which has already held out for a long time, much longer than Moscow's initial predictions. In an effort to find a diplomatic way out to ease the situation, Russia made a calculated proposal to Europe by suggesting former German Chancellor Gerhard Schröder as a mediator for negotiations to end the conflict. For Moscow, this is a safe move and a genuine compromise effort, as this figure is both a former leader with influence in Europe and has extremely close ties to Russia's state energy corporations. He was once directly accused by Russian opposition figure Alexei Navalny of being someone who received money from the Kremlin. In a different context, if Europe still had a mindset of making concessions to bring Russia to the negotiating table, Gerhard Schröder could have become a potential candidate despite his personal scandals. However, the reaction of European leaders this time is a firm rejection, even mocking Moscow's proposal. The unexpected firmness of a group that has always been considered overly cautious is not a coincidence. It happened right after the world witnessed the Kremlin suffering a painful media blow on Victory Day, an event that exposed Russia's weakness to the entire international public. And when their opponent Volodymyr Zelensky delivered a direct taunt at their sore spot, the leaders of the Kremlin could only remain silent and endure it. We cannot see into the heart of the Russian leader, but the image revealed to the whole world on May 9th was a stark reality, a lonely, exhausted, and bewildered man in reality. If that's the case, do you think there will be a complete Russian withdrawal?